He barked on top of the coffin and refused to get off, not out of grief, but because something was still inside. Something breathing, something alive. At first, they thought he was just mourning the girl he loved, but then he growled, then he scratched, and then the truth clawed its way back from the edge of death. This isn't the story of a funeral. It's the story of a dog who sensed what no doctor, no machine, no man could. A dog who tore through walls of silence and cracked open a secret everyone had already buried. And if he hadn't, she never would have opened her eyes again. Who was this dog? What did he know that others didn't? And why did he keep barking when the world had already said goodbye? If you believe in second chances and that loyalty can be louder than death, like this video, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to hear what part hit you hardest. The early morning sun broke through the wisps of mist hanging low over the streets of Fairhaven, a small town tucked away between rolling hills and tired rivers. On any other day, Marcus Carter might have admired the way light gilded the cracked sidewalks and made even the battered storefronts glow with a stubborn dignity. But not today. Today he stood rigidly at the cemetery gates, dressed in a charcoal suit that didn't fit quite right anymore. His broad shoulders slumped under the unbearable weight of grief. Beside him, a handful of mourners gathered quietly, most of them neighbors, some old friends, their faces pale and strained under the somber sky. The air smelled of damp earth and something floral but fading, like an apology too late spoken. In the distance, a modest white coffin sat atop a bed of soft grass, dwarfed by the giant oaks surrounding it. That coffin contained everything Marcus had left of hope. His 6-year-old daughter, Amara. He had rehearsed the moment in his mind all night, walking behind her casket, head hot, hands steady. He owed her that much. But now, standing at the threshold of finality, his legs refused to move, rooted like ancient trees, unwilling to surrender another inch. A firm hand clapped him gently on the back. He was Pastor Raymond, an old family friend with kind, watery eyes, who had agreed to preside over the ceremony. "His time, Marcus," he whispered. Marcus nodded, or thought he did, and forced one foot in front of the other, the rest of the world blurring into a background of murmurs and rustling coats. They proceeded slowly toward the white casket, its innocence obscene against the grimness of the day. In the back of the procession, tethered tightly to Officer Daniels, was King, the black and tan German shepherd, who had never left Amara's side since the day she rescued him from the ruins of her own sadness. King wore a thin black harness today, his official canine badge clipped to the side. But the dog seemed smaller somehow, subdued, his ears pinned back and his deep brown eyes reflecting more sorrow than most of the humans present. As the service began, Marcus barely registered the words, something about light and love, about eternity and peace, but none of it reached him. His mind kept replaying the last morning he had seen Amara alive, her tiny hands clutching a yellow balloon, King trotting behind her with the earnest pride of a knight guarding his princess. A sharp tug on the leash jerked Officer Daniels slightly forward, drawing a few curious glances. King was trembling now, his muscles taut, every fiber of his body locked onto the little white coffin as if it called to him. Daniels muttered a low command, trying to steady the dog, but King ignored him, the leash vibrating with tension. Marcus noticed. So did Jake Marshall, his brother-in-law, standing off to the side in a leather jacket stitched with faded patches and a face carved by years of regret. Jake's veteran instincts flared awake, his sharp gaze narrowing on the dog's posture. This wasn't normal grief. This was something else. Before anyone could react, King emitted a low, urgent growl deep from his chest, a sound Marcus had only heard once before. The night Amara had a seizure so violent it nearly took her life. Daniels gripped the leash tighter, but King's body surged forward, straining against the constraint. Murmurs rippled through the gathered mourners, confusion giving way to concern. Pastor Raymond paused mid-sentence, frowning slightly, while a few of the younger children whimpered at the sight of the distressed animal. Then, without warning, King broke free. His powerful form bolted toward the casket with a speed that startled the assembly into stunned silence. He reached it in a matter of heartbeats, his claws skidding across the wet grass. With a single, graceful leap, King launched himself onto the base of the coffin, his paws thudding heavily against the polished wood. Gasps erupted from the mourners. Officer Daniels stumbled forward, calling sharply for King to stand down. But the dog didn't move. Instead, King lay down across the tiny casket, his body trembling violently, his nose pressing against the seam. A low, rhythmic whine escaped him, a sound so raw, so drenched in sorrow that it cut through the crowd like a blade. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if time itself had frozen, the world holding its breath to witness this sacred, broken moment. Marcus staggered forward, reaching instinctively for King, for anything real in the midst of this nightmare. But Jake stepped into his path, shaking his head almost imperceptibly. "Wait," Jake whispered. "Look at him. Really look." And Marcus did. He saw not grief in King's body but tension, urgency, alertness. It was the same posture King took when he detected a seizure approaching, when he was warning, pleading, demanding action. An ember of something long buried flickered in Marcus's chest. Hope? No, he crushed it down immediately. It was too cruel to hope now. But King didn't relent. He shifted slightly, placing his head directly atop the coffin, paws braced stiffly, nose twitching furiously as if sensing something no one else could. Officer Daniels approached cautiously, hands outstretched. But King bared his teeth not with aggression but with fierce, unwavering protection. Marcus felt Jake's hand clamp around his arm. "Brother," Jake said, voice rough with something that might have been awe or terror. "That dog's telling us something. He's not mourning. He's alerting." The words landed like stones in Marcus's gut. He looked from Jake to King to the casket that held his baby girl. Could it be? No. No sane man would believe it. And yet, he had trusted King with Amara's life before. Why not now? The cemetery stirred uneasily. The pastor trying to regain control of the ceremony, Daniels hesitating, unsure whether to enforce the protocol or honor what every instinct screamed at him to respect. Marcus closed his eyes for one long, agonizing second. When he opened them, the world had narrowed to a single, shattering decision. "Let him stay," Marcus said, his voice low but commanding. "Let him show us." Around him, the mourners shifted, confused, some even scandalized. But Jake nodded. Officer Daniels stepped back, and King remained where he was, a silent sentinel atop the coffin, his trembling subsiding into a focused stillness. A terrible, impossible possibility began to take root inside Marcus's heart, that his daughter wasn't gone after all, that maybe, just maybe, the bond between a little girl and her dog was strong enough to reach across the veil of death itself. Marcus stood motionless, the cool wind tugging at the hem of his jacket, his heart pounding so loud he could hear nothing else. His mind, though clouded with grief, shifted almost instinctively into a mode he hadn't used in years, the clinical, unyielding scrutiny of a former medical examiner. Details flooded back to him in crisp focus. The rigid posture of King atop the coffin, the tension in his hind legs, the way his nose quivered as if detecting something vital. Marcus had seen this behavior before, but not in dogs mourning their dead masters. No, this was different. This was targeted, urgent, diagnostic. His breath caught in his throat as he knelt carefully beside the casket, watching King's every movement. "King," Marcus whispered low, the old authority bleeding into his voice without him even trying. "What are you telling me, boy?" King whined again, a sound that wasn't sadness but insistence. His tail stiff, his entire body wired tight as a bowstring. It wasn't random. It wasn't instinctive grief. Marcus's training screamed at him. This dog is not reacting to death. He's reacting to life. Behind him, Jake Marshall's boots crunched across the frosty grass, his broad frame cutting a determined path through the crowd. Jake had seen enough. Years ago, in another life across endless sand and blood, he had worked alongside military detection dogs. Animals trained to recognize the nearly imperceptible signs of human life buried under rubble or hidden behind enemy lines. Watching King now triggered a memory so vivid Jake could smell the dust and diesel fuel, hear the sharp bark of a shepherd alerting on a collapsed building where they had pulled 3 Marines out alive. "Marcus," Jake said urgently, crouching beside him, lowering his voice so only he could hear. "He's not mourning. He's alerting. I know that stance, I've trusted it with my life before." Marcus shifted his gaze to Jake, disbelief warring with the sliver of hope he'd tried so hard to crack. "You think she's alive in there?" The words felt insane in his mouth, but King's body answered for them, a sharp, desperate bark muffled against the wood of the casket lid. Jake leaned closer, his jaw clenching. I'm telling you, man, this isn't just a dog grieving his kid. He senses something. I don't know what, but damn it, we need to listen. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, concern twisting into confusion. Officer Daniels hovered uncertainly near the casket, looking back toward the funeral director who shook his head in a clear, anxious signal. Pastor Raymond cleared his throat from the podium, attempting to steer the ceremony back on course. But the momentum was lost. The center of gravity had shifted away from hymns and prayers toward the tableau of a desperate dog and two men caught between impossible belief and brutal reality. Marcus straightened slowly, locking eyes with Officer Daniels. "Don't touch that dog," he said, voice sharp enough to cut glass. Daniels hesitated, lowering his hands in surrender. Jake stepped up beside Marcus, his presence solid and immovable, a silent wall of support. For a moment, time hung suspended. Then Marcus turned back to the coffin, heart hammering against his ribs, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill. He placed a trembling hand gently on King's head, feeling the tremors rippling through the dog's muscles. "Amara," Marcus whispered so softly he wasn't sure he had actually spoken. Almost immediately, King's tail gave a single, sharp wag, his nose nudging harder against the seam of the coffin lid. The reaction was unmistakable. It wasn't wishful thinking. It wasn't projection. It was communication. Behind them, Jake scanned the crowd, his instincts prickling with awareness. The tension among the mourners was palpable now, some edging backward as if proximity to the unfolding drama might implicate them somehow. Others stepping closer, drawn by the electric charge of something impossible teetering on the brink of becoming real. Jake spotted the funeral director whispering urgently to one of the cemetery staff, motioning toward the casket with a gesture that screamed of shutting this spectacle down before it spiraled any further. "They're about to step in," Jake muttered to Marcus, his voice low and grim. "We have maybe a minute, two at most, before they try to drag us off." Marcus barely nodded, his mind racing. Years spent analyzing bodies that no longer breathed, searching for any flicker of truth buried beneath the final stillness. How many times had he trusted what his gut told him rather than the machines, the reports, the assumptions? And now, staring at King, who refused to leave, who risked punishment, who would have clawed through the earth itself if Marcus let him, he realized he trusted this more than he trusted any cold protocol. "You're opening it," Marcus said, barely recognizing his own voice. "You're opening that casket." Jake's mouth twisted into a grim smile, a flicker of his old soldier's spirit igniting behind his eyes. "Thought you'd never say it," he muttered. Without waiting for permission, Marcus moved to the side of the casket, his fingers fumbling with the latches hidden beneath the white satin draping. Daniel stepped forward, alarm flashing across his face. "Mr. Carter, please, I can't let—" Jake interjected, stepping smoothly between Daniels and Marcus, his voice calm but ironclad. "Son, you might want to think real hard before you lay hands on this man right now." Something in Jake's tone, something in the way he stood, made Daniels hesitate. Long enough, Marcus's fingers found the first latch and clicked it open with a metallic snap that seemed to echo through the entire cemetery. Gasps rippled through the gathered crowd. The funeral director blanched visibly, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. King whined again, more insistently now, paws scrabbling lightly at the lid as if urging Marcus on. Marcus reached for the second latch. His hands were slick with sweat, his stomach turned over violently. What if he was wrong? What if he opened the casket and found only silence and cold flesh? What if he shattered the last fragile remnants of his sanity, chasing a ghost whispered to him by a dog who couldn't understand death? He hesitated, his fingers trembling over the final clasp. Jake placed a hand on his shoulder. "Trust him," Jake said simply. "Trust King. Trust your girl." Marcus closed his eyes, drawing a shuddering breath deep into his lungs, feeling the weight of every second ticking past. Every eye fixed on him, every prayer or curse rising from the gathering. Then he snapped open the last latch. The final latch clicked open with a sharp metallic snap that seemed to slice through the heavy air. Marcus hesitated only a fraction of a second before he grasped the lid's edge and slowly, painfully lifted it. A cold wave of air escaped, bringing with it the sterile scent of preserved flowers and polished wood. Inside, Amara lay motionless, her tiny form swaddled in white satin, her hands folded neatly across her chest. a small spray of daisies cradled against her shoulder. For a beat, Marcus saw only death, an unbearable stillness that made his vision blur and his heart falter. But King didn't move from his post. If anything, the dog pressed harder against the casket, whining in a rhythm that was no longer just sorrow but insistence. Marcus leaned closer, his trembling hand reaching for his daughter's wrist, feeling like a man slipping into a dream too painful to wake from. His fingers brushed her skin, cool but not the ice-cold rigidity he expected. For a horrifying moment, nothing. Then the faintest twitch beneath his fingertips. A pulse, a whisper of life. "Dear God," Marcus breathed, his voice cracking. "She's not gone?" A collective gasp rippled through the assembled mourners. Officer Daniels muttered something under his breath and instinctively stepped back. Jake swore softly, shock etched into every line of his weathered face. The funeral director paled. Philibenth paddled with his phone, perhaps to call anyone who could make this nightmare vanish. Pastor Raymond dropped his Bible with a soft thud on the grass, staring in stunned disbelief. King let out a sharp, triumphant bark, his tail thumping once against the coffin before he resumed his vigilant stance. Amid the stunned silence, a small voice rang out high and clear. "I told you she wasn't gone," it said. Heads turned as a little boy stepped forward from the edge of the gathering. He was about Amara's age, with a mop of curly hair and wide, earnest eyes. His name was Elijah, a neighbor's son, and one of Amara's closest friends. Elijah lived with autism, his mind working in ways that most adults barely understood. But no one could deny the strange, intuitive truths he often spoke. He had clutched a handmade card throughout the service, a card he refused to place in the tribute basket because, as he had whispered stubbornly to his mother earlier, Amara still needs it. Now, standing only a few feet from the open casket, Elijah repeated with an eerie calmness, "She hasn't gone anywhere. She's still here. I can feel her." His words, so simple yet so profound, swept through the crowd like a sudden wind, rattling the brittle facade of grief they had all clung to. Murmurs broke out, people shifting uncomfortably, exchanging glances filled with fear, hope, and something dangerously close to wonder. Marcus barely registered them. His whole world had contracted to the tiny flutter beneath Amara's skin, the nearly invisible rise and fall of her chest. His training kicked in hard now, blunting panic, sharpening focus. "Jake, call 911, he barked, his hands already moving to lift Amara carefully out of the coffin. Jake didn't hesitate, spinning on his heel and pulling his phone from his jacket. As he punched in the numbers, his mind raced, piecing together a horror he hadn't dared voice yet. Marcus cradled Amara against his chest, murmuring soothing words even though she remained unresponsive, her eyelids fluttering faintly. King hovered close, his nose bumping gently against Amara's knee as if encouraging her to stay tethered to the living world. The sirens in the distance grew louder, winding their way through Fairhaven's sleepy streets, but Marcus's mind wasn't on the approaching ambulance. It was on the hospital, the one that had declared his daughter dead without the proper tests, the one that had rushed her into a body bag and released her to the funeral home without a second opinion. His hands clenched reflexively around Amara, rage bubbling under the surface of his fear. He knew Riverbend Medical Center too well. Years ago, fresh out of training, he had completed part of his residency there. Even then, whispers had circulated about cut corners, about administrative pressures to keep costs down and patient turnover high. But he hadn't stayed long enough to see the rot take root. He hadn't realized how deep it had spread. Until now, the attending physician who signed Amara's death certificate, Dr. Leonard Pierce, had once been under review for a fatal misdiagnosis involving a teenager from the poorer side of town. A case quietly settled out of court, buried under a mountain of non-disclosure agreements and sealed records. Marcus's fists clenched at the memory. How many lives had been lost to carelessness masked as efficiency? How many parents had been told their children were gone when they were not? The sirens screeched to a halt outside the cemetery gates, and moments later, EMTs poured into the grounds, their movements brisk but faltering when they saw the open casket and the child held protectively in Marcus's arms. "You need a crash kit now," barked one of the medics, a woman whose face hardened into professionalism as she assessed the situation. Another medic moved to assist, setting up a portable monitor and oxygen supply. "Sir, we'll take it from here," he said, reaching for Amara. But Marcus shook his head. I'm coming with her, he said hoarsely. You're not taking her anywhere without me. The medic nodded briskly, reading the iron resolve in his face. Together they moved swiftly, securing Amara onto a gurney, attaching monitors, slipping an oxygen mask over her delicate features. The mourners parted like water before them, stunned and silent, watching the dead come back to life. Pastor Raymond whispered a prayer under his breath, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. Elijah clutched his card tighter, refusing to let go. As the gurney wheeled toward the waiting ambulance, Kang tried to follow, whimpering urgently. Jake grabbed his collar gently, keeping him back but murmuring reassurances. We'll be right behind her, boy, right behind her. Marcus climbed into the ambulance without looking back. The doors slammed shut, and the vehicle roared away, leaving a field of stunned faces and a coffin lying abandoned under the ancient oak trees. But behind the veil of stunned silence, gears had already begun to turn. Whispers spread. Accusations brewed. The funeral director wiped his forehead with a trembling hand, muttering something about hospital protocols and mistakes that couldn't possibly happen here. Officer Daniels radioed his superior, his voice low and tense, and at the heart of it all stood Elijah, who simply stared at the road where the ambulance had disappeared, and repeated under his breath like a mantra, I told you she wasn't gone. Inside the speeding ambulance, Marcus sat hunched over Amara, cradling her fragile body with trembling arms as the medic worked furiously beside him, calling out vital signs and administering emergency measures. But even as the sirens howled and the paramedic's voice barked in sharp commands, Marcus's mind refused to stay anchored in the present. His thoughts spun backward to just moments ago, standing at the gravesite with the impossible truth unfolding before their stunned eyes. Back at the cemetery, chaos had erupted after Marcus found the faint flicker of life in his daughter's pulse. King, ever vigilant, had not simply lain atop the coffin anymore. As Marcus lifted Amara free, King had shifted into another mode entirely, a mode Jake recognized instantly, and it chilled him to his bones. The shepherd had begun clawing furiously at the lid of the casket, scraping with rhythmic, desperate strokes of his powerful paws. It wasn't random. It wasn't grief. It was a trained, alert signal, one Jake had seen many times before in military operations, when a dog detected the living trapped under rubble, when seconds could mean the difference between rescue and death. Every claw swipe King made was deliberate, almost mechanical, a repeated pattern that screamed urgency. The assembled mourners, already reeling from the revelation of Amara's survival, recoiled further, some crossing themselves, others whispering in frightened tones. The funeral director, red-faced and sweating profusely, stormed toward Marcus, his hands flailing in furious gestures. This is highly irregular. Sir, you have no authority to tamper with the remains, he shouted, voice cracking under the strain. Officer Daniels moved stiffly toward Marcus, as if unsure whether to intervene, casting a desperate glance toward his radio, likely debating whether to call for backup. Pastor Raymond stood frozen at his podium, lips working silently, as if praying for deliverance from the madness unfurling before him. Marcus turned to face them all, still cradling Amara, his voice rising above the confusion, deep and thundering with a rage born of terror and love. I don't give a damn about your procedures, he said, every syllable cutting through the cold morning air like a blade. If you try to stop me, I'll open this casket myself. I'll tear it apart with my bare hands if I have to. My daughter is alive, and no one, not you, not this hospital, not this damn funeral home, is going to bury her again. His words hit the crowd like a physical force, a shockwave that left them stunned and blinking. Jake stepped up beside him, his broad frame coiled tight with restrained fury, his eyes scanning the perimeter for any sign of intervention. Back off, Jake growled toward Daniels and the funeral director, his hand subtly moving toward the inside of his jacket where, years ago, a sidearm would have been holstered. He wasn't armed today, but the threat in his body language was clear enough. Officer Daniels hesitated, then took a cautious step back, lowering his radio slowly. The funeral director blustered, his face flushing an unhealthy purple, but he too seemed to think better of pressing the matter. All around them, the mourners watched, divided between outrage and awe. Some shook their heads, muttering about propriety and dignity, while others found themselves rooted to the spot, unable to look away from the unfolding miracle or catastrophe. Through it all, King never ceased his urgent clawing at the casket, his nails scraping deep grooves into the polished wood, each stroke sending shivers through the already unstable crowd. Marcus knelt again beside the coffin, laying Amara down gently on a soft blanket someone had thrust into his arms, checking her breathing, adjusting the oxygen mask the medic had managed to secure before they left. His hands worked with practiced precision, muscle memory from his long-forgotten medical training taking over. But his heart was a storm of anguish, rage, and fragile, desperate hope. "Stay with me, baby," he whispered hoarsely. "I'm not letting you go." The sirens grew louder now, and Jake glanced toward the cemetery gates where flashing red lights signaled the arrival of the ambulance and police backup. Reinforcements. More people who might try to wrest control away from Marcus, to shove Amara back into some bureaucratic box labeled dead or dying or beyond saving. No, not again. Not ever again. Jake planted himself firmly between Marcus and the approaching officials, his arms crossed, his stance broadcasting silent defiance. Officer Daniels spoke into his shoulder radio in hushed, urgent tones, gesturing toward the gathering. It wouldn't be long before someone tried to assert authority again. Marcus felt the seconds ticking away, each heartbeat a countdown toward another fight, another struggle. He looked up at Jake, his old friend, his brother in arms through marriage and loss, and found unwavering support in his gaze. No matter what came next, Jake would stand with him. King would stand with him. And Amara, sweet, stubborn Amara, was still fighting, her chest rising and falling with a fragile rhythm that Marcus would tear the heavens apart to protect. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman sobbed openly. Pastor Raymond finally found his voice, lifting it in a broken, trembling prayer that wrapped around the field like a balm and a battle cry all at once. And King, relentless King, shifted tactics. Abandoning the now mangled casket lid, the dog pressed his forehead against Amara's tiny hand, whining low and steady, willing her to wake up, to fight harder. Marcus bowed his head over his daughter, squeezing her fingers gently, breathing in her scent mixed with antiseptic and earth. He whispered again, not to the crowd, not to the heavens, but to Amara and to the fire that burned in his own battered chest. "You're not going anywhere, princess. Not if I have anything to say about it." The ambulance doors swung open with a metallic clatter, and Marcus surged out, cradling Amara against his chest, shouting for help even before his feet hit the pavement. The paramedics rushed to meet him, wheeling a gurney toward them at breakneck speed. They moved efficiently, attaching electrodes, checking vital signs, slipping an oxygen mask back over Amara's small face. But Marcus didn't need a monitor to know the truth. He could feel it in the flutter of her pulse against his fingertips. Weak but undeniable. She was still fighting, still here. At the same time, back at the cemetery, the chaos Marcus and Jake had ignited was only just beginning to bloom. Jake remained behind, standing like a sentinel among the bewildered mourners. King, after a final, lingering touch of Amara's hand, had been reluctantly loaded into a police vehicle at Officer Daniels' reluctant but necessary insistence. The shepherd's mournful whines faded into the background as the focus shifted to the casket left abandoned on the green lawn. An uneasy silence settled, heavy and prickling, as if the whole town had been caught holding its collective breath. Among the crowd, unnoticed at first, a teenager with shaggy hair and an old hoodie fiddled nervously with his phone. His name was Jason Bell, a junior at the local high school and an aspiring filmmaker who never went anywhere without recording equipment tucked away in his backpack. Today he had filmed the funeral for a school project on community traditions, thinking it would be a quiet, respectful ceremony. What he captured instead was something no one would ever believe without seeing. Hands trembling, Jason replayed the footage on his cracked screen, heart hammering against his ribs. The video clearly showed King's frantic behavior, Marcus's discovery of Amara's heartbeat, and most damning of all, the frozen, guilty expressions of the funeral director and several hospital-affiliated staff members lingering near the casket. Jason swallowed hard, glancing up to see the funeral director still arguing heatedly with Officer Daniels, sweat pouring down his ruddy face. He knew instinctively that if he showed them the video now, it might mysteriously disappear. No, he needed to be smart, Jason slipped through the crowd, keeping his head down, clutching the phone tight against his side. He would upload the footage online as soon as he got home. The truth needed witnesses. Meanwhile, at Riverbend Medical Center, the emergency room roared into action. Marcus refused to leave Amara's side, ignoring every protocol, every barked order from harried staff who seemed far more concerned about procedure than the miracle unfolding before them. When Dr. Leonard Pierce arrived, summoned from his office by the escalating commotion, his face twisted into a mask of disbelief and poorly concealed panic. "This is impossible," he muttered under his breath, his pale hands fluttering uselessly at his sides. The death certificate was properly signed, all protocols were followed, but Marcus was already advancing on him, a force of nature clad in grief and righteousness. "You tried to bury my daughter alive," he snarled, his voice low and lethal. "You signed her death warrant without even running a damn EEG." The words were daggers, each one finding its mark. Dr. Pierce flinched, opening his mouth to respond, but Jake, who had just arrived, dust still on his boots from the cemetery, stepped in, his presence looming. "Not another word," Jake growled. "You're going to sit your ass down and wait for the authorities." At that moment, a young nurse burst into the room, holding a tablet aloft. "Dr. Pierce," she gasped, her face pale. "You need to see this." Jason's video had already gone viral. Uploaded under the title "Girl Declared Dead Found Alive at Funeral, Watch the Dog That Saved Her." It had exploded across social media within minutes. Thousands of views. Hundreds of shares, comments pouring in by the second. There, for all the world to see, was the footage of Marcus lifting Amara from her coffin. There was King, clawing and whining with heart-shattering desperation. There was the funeral director's panic, the hospital staff's stunned silence. There was no hiding it now. The room seemed to tilt around Dr. Pierce. His grip on the tablet slackened, and the device clattered to the floor with a sharp crack. I need to consult legal," he stammered, backing away toward the door. "You're not going anywhere," Marcus said, moving to block his retreat, Jake close behind him, hands flexing at his sides. The nurse stood frozen, unsure which authority to obey. Officer Daniels arrived then, breathless from sprinting across the hospital parking lot, his radio crackling with frantic updates. He took one look at the situation, the furious father, the trembling doctor, the viral video, and nodded grimly. "You're all coming with me," he said. "Internal Affairs is already on their way, and so is the state medical board." Outside the hospital, news vans were already pulling into the parking lot, their satellite dishes whirring to life as reporters swarmed the entrance. Cameras flashed, microphones jostled. Fairhaven had never seen a scandal like this before, and the world was watching. Amid the chaos, Marcus returned to Amara's side, brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead. Machines beeped reassuringly around them, monitoring her fragile but stabilizing vitals. A nurse, kinder than the rest, slipped into the room with a damp cloth, gently wiping Amara's face, whispering soft reassurance. King was brought into the hospital a few minutes later, despite every rule against animals in the emergency department. Officer Daniels had overruled the objections himself, growling that if not for that damn dog, they'd all be attending a real funeral by now. The shepherd padded into the room, tail low, eyes locked onto Amara. He laid his head gently on the side of her bed, letting out a sigh that sounded almost human in its relief. Marcus watched them, a fresh wave of emotion threatening to buckle his knees. His daughter was alive. She was here. And because of a dog's loyalty and a little boy's stubborn faith, the lies that almost stole her away were unraveling for the entire world to see. He didn't know what battles still lay ahead, the endless questions. But he knew one thing beyond all doubt. They weren't done fighting, not by a long shot. The sterile white of the hospital room did little to soften the tension coiling in Marcus's chest as he sat beside Amara's bed, watching her small chest rise and fall beneath the thin blanket. Monitors beeped steadily, blinking lights casting rhythmic shadows across the walls. But even their mechanical reassurance couldn't quiet the storm of dread tightening in his gut. Jake stood near the window, arms folded, eyes scanning every nurse and doctor who passed by as if daring one of them to make a move he didn't approve of. King, lying curled up near the foot of the bed, had not left Amara's side since he was allowed back in, his body rigid with silent attention, ears occasionally flicking at the faintest sound. It was quiet now, too quiet, but it wouldn't be for long. Moments earlier, the nurse who had brought in the damp cloth had returned with a paper Marcus hadn't expected. On it, under the official hospital letterhead, was a notice of scheduled cremation. Date, today. Time, 2:15 p.m. Marcus's eyes scanned the page again and again, rage rising like bile in his throat. If King hadn't intervened, if the casket had been closed 1 hour earlier, if they hadn't fought tooth and nail to stop the ceremony, Amira would be ash, not a coma patient, not a miracle, ash. His fists clenched around the papers until it crumpled in his hand. Jake read over his shoulder, the skin tightening around his eyes as he exhaled a string of curses under his breath. They were going to burn her alive, Marcus said hoarsely, without even a final verification. Not a second opinion, nothing. Jake nodded grimly, and not a damn person would have questioned it if that dog hadn't sounded the alarm. Makes you wonder how many others didn't get that second chance. Marcus's jaw clenched, his teeth grinding. This wasn't just about Amara anymore. It was about a system that nearly erased her. Then, without warning, King's body tensed. He stood up in one fluid motion, nose twitching, ears snapping forward with a force that made Marcus rise instantly from his chair. The German shepherd moved toward Amara's side, pressing his body against her, and letting out a low, keening whine. Not the mournful kind, no. Marcus knew this sound. It was the same urgent pattern from the graveyard, the same warning that had shattered the illusion of death. Something's wrong, Marcus said, already moving toward the monitors. King's alerting. The nurse who had just stepped in looked confused. Everything looks stable, Mr. Carter. Her oxygen's holding. Heart rate steady. No, I knows. I don't care what the damn screen says. Page a doctor now. The nurse hesitated for a beat too long. Then, just as she reached for the call button, the monitor began to scream. Oxygen levels plummeted. Heart rate stuttered. Blood pressure dropped like a stone. Alarms flared through the room, and within seconds, chaos erupted. The crash team stormed in with carts and masks, epinephrine syringes and defibrillator pads. Marcus backed away, giving them room, but his eyes never left King. The dog was pacing tightly beside the bed, his tail stiff, whimpering as though he could will the machines to bring her back. Through the window, Jake pressed a hand against the glass, jaw clenched as he watched the team surround his niece. The lead doctor barked orders: intubate, stabilize, increase fluids, but even with their swift response, it was clear something had shifted. Marcus's mind reeled. The second time King had known, before the monitors, before the doctors, before anyone. The dog had saved her life again. Minutes crawled by like lifetimes until finally, the head nurse looked up, sweat beading at her brow. She's stabilizing, she said. Respiration's back, pulses climbing, she's holding. Marcus exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding and nearly collapsed into the chair. King laid back down beside the bed, eyes locked on Amara, posture still tense but slowly easing. The doctor glanced up at Marcus. How did you know that she was crashing? Marcus pointed at King. He knew. Every time. He's her early warning system. You'd do well to listen next time. The doctor didn't respond but offered a short nod, his eyes flicking toward the dog with something like newfound respect. Outside the room, hospital administrators were gathering in tight clusters, their voices hushed but sharp. Legal representatives from both the hospital and the state had begun arriving, summoned in the wake of the viral video that continued to gain traction. Already, questions were spiraling out of control. How had Riverbend certified a living child as dead? Why had there been no final medical examination before cremation authorization? How many others had gone through the same process without anyone ever knowing? In the hallway, a young reporter from a regional news outlet whispered urgently into her phone, while holding up a printed screenshot of Jason Bell's video. Yes, it's real, she hissed. The child was alive. No, they didn't check, and the dog, he warned them all. Meanwhile, back in the room, Marcus pulled up a chair closer to Amara's bed. He reached out and brushed his fingers against her cheek. Still cool, still pale, but undeniably alive. I'm right here, baby, he whispered. You're not going anywhere. Jake entered a moment later, slipping silently through the door, nodding toward the machines. The system's burning outside, he said, They're scrambling, phones are ringing off the walls. "You shook something loose, brother." "No," Marcus replied, eyes still on Amara. "King did." The ICU at Riverbend Medical Center hummed with a low, steady urgency as Marcus sat vigil by Amara's bedside, his hand lightly resting on her small, fragile one, feeling the faint pulse beat beneath her skin, clinging to every sign of life like a drowning man grasping a lifeline. King lay curled at Amara's feet, his body tense but still, his dark brown and black fur blending into the shadows of the dim room, his ears twitching with every beep of the monitors, his nose flaring every time Amara shifted even slightly under the white sheets. It had been 72 hours since the world flipped upside down, 72 hours of an endless, brutal fight that neither Marcus nor King intended to lose. The first 12 hours had been chaos, a relentless battle against Amara's failing vitals, her oxygen dipping, her heart rate stuttering, her blood pressure swinging wildly. And through it all, King refused to leave, refused even to rest his head fully, as if sensing that his vigilance was the only thing keeping her tethered to this world. Doctors and nurses had argued about hospital policies, about infection control, about the absurdity of a dog in the ICU. But Marcus had shut them down cold, his voice a low growl that brooked no argument, and Jake had backed him up with the looming presence of a man ready to tear apart anything that threatened his niece's survival. It wasn't the first time King had saved Amara, and Marcus knew it wouldn't be the last. Twice before, in the quiet of their small home, King had alerted Marcus to impending seizures, giving him precious minutes to administer medication, to cushion Amara's small body before the convulsions hit, to prevent the worst outcomes that doctors had warned could one day steal her away for good. But this was a different battlefield altogether. King stayed pressed against Amara's legs, occasionally rising to lick her fingers, to whine low in his throat when the monitors blipped in worrying patterns. His loyalty a force so tangible it thickened the very air in the room. Marcus slept only in stolen seconds, his head sagging onto Amara's bed, before jerking up at every alarm, every movement, his mind a haze of fear and exhaustion, but his determination sharpened by the raw need to keep her alive. Jake came and went, bringing food Marcus barely touched, forcing him to drink water, sometimes standing silently in the doorway just to be a witness, a backup, a presence of solidarity. Every time Marcus faltered, he would look at King and find a mirror of his own will to endure, to stand firm no matter how dark the hours became. On the second night, when the tremors in Amara's small frame grew worse and her fever spiked dangerously, King was the first to react, rising with a growl from his place at her feet and placing his front paws gently on the side of the bed, nudging her arm, whining until Marcus jolted awake and summoned the crash team. Without King's warning, Marcus knew they might have lost her then, but they didn't, because King was there, because King never stopped fighting. As dawn broke on the third morning, lights slanting in pale gray through the blinds, Marcus sat slumped in the chair, fingers wrapped around Amara's hand, his head bowed in exhausted prayer, silent tears tracking down his unshaven cheeks. King lifted his head slowly, his dark eyes fixed intently on Amara's face, his body going rigid in the way that Marcus now recognized instantly, not fear, not confusion, but alertness. Marcus leaned forward, heart hammering, as Amara's fingers twitched faintly against his palm. For a terrifying moment he thought he had imagined it, that the desperate hope inside him had conjured a false miracle. But then it happened again, stronger this time. A purposeful squeeze so weak it might have been missed by anyone not holding on as tightly as Marcus was. "Amara?" Marcus breathed, his voice cracking. "Baby girl, can you hear me?" The monitors remained steady, but Marcus's world narrowed to the tiny movement of her lips, a soft fluttering like a butterfly testing its wings after a long winter. King stood fully now, his tail stiff, his body vibrating with suppressed energy. He let out a low, urgent whine, and Marcus watched his heart breaking open anew as Amara's eyelids flickered, struggling against the heavy weight of unconsciousness. For long moments she fought, her face contorting with effort, until finally, with a gasp so faint it barely stirred the air, her eyes. Marcus leaned closer, tears flooding his vision, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Mara, it's Daddy. I'm right here, baby. You're safe. You're safe." Her gaze drifted, lost, as if she couldn't quite find her bearings, couldn't yet piece together the broken fragments of her world. And then, with a hoarse, broken whisper, the first word tumbled from her chapped lips. She hadn't called for him. She hadn't asked for her father, or her mother, or even for God. She had called for the dog who had never left her side, who had fought every step of the way to bring her back. King let out a sharp bark of joy, tail thumping once against the wall, then leapt lightly onto the edge of the bed, careful not to disturb the IV lines, the wires, the fragile machines. He lowered his massive head until his nose touched her trembling hand, and Amara's fingers curled weakly into his fur, anchoring herself to the world through the bond that had refused to let her go. Marcus pressed his forehead to Amara's arm, sobbing openly now, no longer caring who saw, no longer needing to hold the pieces of himself together. She was alive, she was fighting, and she was not alone. As Amara clung stubbornly to the fragile thread of life, the world outside her hospital room shifted and churned like a brewing storm. Marcus sat beside her, Kim resting his massive head across Amara's legs, the monitors casting a steady electronic heartbeat into the tense air. But while the little family fought their battle inside, another war had ignited beyond the ICU doors, a war for truth, for justice, and for redemption. It began with a whisper, as all revolutions do. A young nurse named Eliza Tran, barely 25 and barely out of nursing school, watched from the sidelines as hospital executives closed ranks, as lawyers circled like vultures, as the administration crafted statements designed to shield themselves while quietly letting Dr. Leonard Pierce take the brunt of the fallout. She had seen enough in her short time at Riverbend Medical Center to know the truth was uglier than anyone wanted to admit. She remembered too well how the paperwork had been rushed, how no EEG had ever been ordered, how Pierce had insisted they clear the bed quickly to make room for another high-profile patient with better insurance. She remembered how uncomfortable she had felt, but how fear had kept her silent until now. It was King who changed everything for her. Watching the black and brown shepherd refuse to abandon his post, seeing the way Amara's tiny fingers clutched at his fur, Eliza realized she couldn't stay quiet anymore. Late one night, when the administration offices were deserted and security was minimal, Eliza crept into the hospital records room, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it would betray her. She found the original reports, the deleted EG order requests, the notes from nurses who had questioned the death pronouncement, the quiet reassignments of staff who had protested. She loaded everything onto a thumb drive, tucked it deep inside the lining of her scrubs, and slipped it into her locker until she could find the right moment to act. That moment came 2 days later, when Jake caught her lingering near Amara's room. Her face pale and determined, she pressed the small drive into his hand without a word, her fingers shaking. "Give it to someone who can make it count," she whispered before hurrying away down the sterile hallway, her ponytail bouncing behind her. Jake, never one to waste time, immediately handed it off to Marcus, who reviewed the files with growing horror, his jaw tightening with every damning piece of evidence. They had tried to erase Amara to save themselves. They had almost succeeded, but not anymore. Fueled by righteous fury, Marcus contacted a civil rights attorney named Cassandra Reed, a formidable woman whose reputation for dismantling corrupt institutions was legendary across the state. Cassandra reviewed the evidence within hours and filed a lawsuit so blistering it made national headlines before the ink was dry. Amara Carter v. Riverbend Medical Center, Dr. Leonard Pierce. The lawsuit alleged gross negligence, reckless endangerment, violation of civil rights, and a willful cover-up. Simultaneously, Jason Bell's funeral video continued its viral march across the internet, reaching millions within days. News anchors debated the scandal in primetime slots. Talk shows brought on medical experts to dissect every mistake. Blaggers and influencers railed against the injustice, amplifying the story beyond what Marcus ever could have imagined. Fairhaven, a sleepy town known for little more than its autumn festivals and scenic hiking trails, became the epicenter of a national reckoning. But it was the townspeople themselves who delivered the biggest blow, sparked by a local teacher who had once taught Amara in kindergarten. A petition began circulating around Fairhaven. It demanded full criminal investigation into Riverbend Medical Center's practices, immediate suspension of Dr. Pierce's license, and comprehensive reforms in hospital death verification procedures. Within 24 hours, the petition had over 10,000 signatures, more than the entire population of Fairhaven itself, as neighboring towns and sympathetic strangers added their names. They signed because they saw their own children in Amara's smile, their own families in Marcus's desperate fight, their own faith in King's unbreakable devotion. The groundswell grew into something unstoppable. Candlelight vigils were held outside the hospital, crowds gathering with signs that read, "Justice for Amara," and "Listen to the dogs when they bark." School children painted murals of King with wings, standing guard over a sleeping Amara. The images plastered across social media with the hashtag #AmaraStrong. Major news networks dispatched trucks to Fairhaven. Satellite vans lined the hospital parking lots. Helicopters thumped overhead. Marcus barely noticed. His world remained centered on the little girl lying so still beneath the crisp white sheets and the dog who refused to let her slip away. But he knew the pressure was built, squeezing the hospital's administration, the state medical board, even the politicians who had once pretended Fairhaven didn't exist. They couldn't hide anymore. Marcus's phone buzzed with messages from reporters, advocates, even strangers offering support. He ignored most of them, focusing instead on Cassandra's steady updates. The Sill case was moving faster than anyone anticipated, bolstered by the overwhelming public support and the irrefutable evidence Eliza had risked everything to obtain. Still, Marcus knew it wasn't over, not until Amara opened her eyes fully, not until she could speak her truth, not until the people who had tried to silence her were held accountable in every way that mattered. As the sun set over Fairhaven, casting long shadows across the hospital's weathered brick walls, King stirred beside Amara's bed, lifting his head and staring toward the door with sudden intensity, as if sensing that the real battle was just. The first snowfall of December dusted Fairhaven in a soft blanket of white, as Amara lay nestled among the endless whirring machines and gentle beeps that had become the soundtrack of her fragile existence. Marcus remained planted by her side, his fingers curled protectively around her small hand, while King stretched along the floor, his dark brown and black fur blending into the sterile linoleum, his deep eyes fixed unwaveringly on Amara's face. The media frenzy outside the hospital had not abated, but inside her quiet room time moved differently, slower, measured by the shallow rise and fall of Amara's chest, and the tiny movements that hinted at the life still burning stubbornly inside her. Dr. Eliza Montgomery, the neurologist from Children's Memorial Hospital, had flown in personally after seeing the national coverage, determined to assess the girl who had defied death not once but twice. She was a stern woman with silver-streaked hair and quick, thoughtful eyes, and when she entered the room, she greeted Marcus with a nod that spoke volumes without words. She examined Amara with meticulous care, reviewing every scan, every chart, every obscure piece of data, frowning and humming under her breath. Marcus sat rigid in his chair, bracing himself for another verdict, another crushing prognosis. But what came next shook him to his core. "She has sustained brain injury," Dr. Montgomery said slowly, her voice measured, "but it's not as catastrophic as we feared. Motor functions, memory, and higher reasoning are affected. But the limbic system, the seat of emotion, of connection, of fundamental awareness, is largely intact." Marcus stared at her, struggling to process the words. For the news that Amara would never know him, never recognize King, never smile or laugh or cry again. But this meant there was hope. "She can feel," Dr. Montgomery continued. "She can connect. She can rebuild." Tears blurred Marcus's vision, and he squeezed Amara's hand tighter, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. "You hear that, baby girl?" he whispered. "You're still you. You're still my Amara." King let out a low, approving rumble from the floor, his tail thudding once against the ground. Over the following days, a new rhythm emerged. Long therapy sessions interspersed with deep, exhausted sleep, visits from specialists who measured cognitive responses, flashes of light and sound stimuli designed to coax Amara further out of her cocoon of unconsciousness. Slowly, like the first shoots of spring pressing through frost-hardened soil, signs of awakening emerged. A twitch of fingers, a flutter of eyelashes, a soft sound escaping her lips when Marcus or King came near. On the 7th morning after Dr. Montgomery's arrival, Amara stirred more than she ever had before, her eyes opening fully for the first time, still glassy but brighter, clearer, filled with the painful, beautiful spark of awareness. Marcus leaned in immediately, heart hammering in his chest. "Amara, can you hear me, baby?" Her gaze drifted toward him, unfocused at first, then sharpened with a glimmer of recognition that sent a sob tearing from his throat. But it wasn't until King shifted onto the bed, resting his great head gently on her lap, that Amara truly responded. Her fingers moved clumsily but deliberately, tangling themselves in King's fur. A soft, hoarse whisper escaped her cracked lips. Marcus wiped at his eyes, laughing through his tears. "Yeah, baby, King's right here. He's not going anywhere." Amara's lips moved again, slower this time, as if she was gathering strength to form something more. Marcus leaned closer, holding his breath. Baby doesn't have any fear," he murmured, the words fragmented but crystal clear to Marcus. Their meaning pierced. He looked at Dr. Montgomery, who stood frozen, her eyes wide with astonishment. "What did you say, sweetheart?" Marcus urged softly, brushing a curl from Amara's forehead. Amara blinked slowly, her gaze swimming with exhaustion and confusion. But she pressed on. Can bark, he told me not to go?" A ragged sob broke free from Marcus's chest, and he cradled her hand against his cheek, overwhelmed by the depth of what she had just revealed. Somewhere deep within the haze of her coma, in the liminal space between life and death, Amara had heard King's desperate barks. She had felt his refusal to let her slip away. She had listened and she had stayed. Dr. Montgomery knelt beside the bed, her professional veneer cracking under the weight of the moment. "This," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else, "this is extraordinary. There are studies about coma patients perceiving external stimuli, but this—" Marcus kissed Amara's forehead, whispering promises of adventures yet to come, of Christmases and birthdays and lazy Sunday mornings filled with pancakes and cartoons. King huffed a soft breath and snuggled closer, his body a living shield against the cold, sterile world beyond the hospital walls. They had come so far, fought through darkness and despair, clung to the thinnest threads of hope when everyone else had given up. And now, against every prediction, against every statistical probability, Amara was coming back to them, not just breathing, not just existing, but feeling, remembering, choosing to stay tethered to the world by the unbreakable bond of love. Winter had deepened its grip on Fairhaven, casting the town into a soft world of snow and shimmering frost. But inside the town hall, the air buzzed with warmth, with excitement, with the kind of reverence usually reserved for heroes returning from war. Rows of folding chairs stretched across the gleaming wooden floor, packed with townspeople bundled in coats and scarves, their breath misting in the chill as they waited for the ceremony to begin. Banners hung from the rafters read, "Thank you, King," and "A hero's heart never gives up," their bold letters bright against the muted winter light filtering through the tall windows. At the front of the hall, a small platform had been erected, adorned with red, white, and blue ribbons and a polished wooden podium where Mayor Edlund Carter, no relation to Marcus, adjusted her notes nervously. But all eyes were not on the mayor, nor on the gleaming metal resting on a velvet cushion beside her. They were on the figure being wheeled slowly up the center aisle, a frail but determined little girl bundled in a thick blue coat, her curls peeking from beneath a knitted hat, her legs tucked beneath a blanket in her wheelchair. Amara Carter, alive, fighting, smiling. Beside her, leading the way with the proud, dignified air of a seasoned soldier, walked King, his sleek brown and black coat groomed to a glossy shine, a special harness fitted across his broad chest bearing a simple patch that read Guardian. Marcus pushed Amara's wheelchair carefully, his hand steady on the handle, his heart hammering against his ribs as they moved through the sea of standing, applauding townsfolk. Jake flanked them, a quiet sentinel, his weathered face softened by emotion he didn't bother to hide. When they reached the stage, Marcus helped lift Amara gently onto a small platform built specifically for her, careful to adjust her blanket and tuck the metal's velvet cushion within easy reach. The mayor stepped forward, clearing her throat, her voice cracking slightly as she spoke. "We gather here today," she began, "to honor a true hero, not one who carries a weapon or wears a uniform, but one who reminds us that courage, loyalty, and love come in all forms. Today we celebrate King, whose unwavering devotion saved a life and inspired a nation." She gestured to the velvet cushion and the crowd leaned forward, breathless, as Marcus placed the medal in Amara's lap. The little girl's hands shook with effort, but she clutched the ribbon tightly, her brows furrowed in fierce concentration. King sat before her, posture perfect, eyes locked onto hers with a depth of understanding. Dolph explained patiently, and Adrian's life forward, lifting the medal with trembling fingers and looping it over King's great head. The heavy gold disc settled against his chest with a soft clink, catching the light as if it had been forged from stardust and love. A collective gasp swept through the room, followed by the thunderous sound of applause. But Amara wasn't finished. Her tiny voice, hoarse from disuse but clear as a bell, carried through the hushed hall. "King," she said, tears shining in her wide eyes. "For not letting me go?" The mayor wiped at her eyes. So did half the audience. Marcus had to clench his jaw to keep from sobbing aloud as he knelt beside his daughter, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. King responded the only way he knew how, by pressing his forehead gently against Amara's, his body vibrating with a low, joyful rumble that spoke louder than any human language could. Later that evening, after the speeches were done and the flashbulbs had stopped popping and the television crews had packed away their cameras, Marcus wheeled Amara onto the back deck of their modest home, the cold, crisp air filled with the scent of pine and distant wood smoke. The first real snowfall of the season had begun, thick, heavy flakes tumbling from the slate-gray sky in lazy spirals. Amara giggled softly, the sound still scratchy but filled with life, as she reached out a mittened hand to catch the snow on her palm. "Look, Daddy," she whispered, holding out her hand. "It's magic." Marcus smiled, his heart aching with the simple beauty of it. "It's all magic, baby girl," he said, lifting his face to the sky. Then King bounded down the steps, sending up a spray of powdery white with each joyful leap. He ran circles around Amara's wheelchair, barking once, twice, his breath puffing like smoke in the frozen air, his paws leaving clear tracks in the fresh snow. Amara clapped her hands, laughing for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, and Marcus's chest tightened with a fierce, overwhelming gratitude. As King circled tighter, his paw prints began to form a shape, a rough but unmistakable heart etched into the blanket of snow, encircling Amara like a living promise. Marcus stepped back, swallowing hard against the lump in his throat as he took in the sight. King stood in the center of the heart now, tail wagging slowly, his body angled protectively toward Amara, his dark eyes gleaming with devotion. It was not mere instinct that had guided him these past months, not just training or coincidence. It was love. It was something older and deeper than memory, stronger than fear, something that no sickness, no mistake, no death certificate could erase. Amara reached out again, her hand brushing the air as if trying to coax a heart surrounding her. "He's my angel," she said simply, her voice filled with absolute certainty. "My angel with paws." Marcus dropped to one knee beside her, pulling both her and King into his arms as the snow fell around them, silent and endless and pure. Above them, the stars began to pierce the winter sky, tiny points of hope scattered across the velvet dark. And somewhere deep in his soul, Marcus knew that whatever storms still lay ahead, whatever battles they still had to fight, they would face them together, bound forever by the kind of love that never surrendered, the kind of loyalty that carved hearts into snowdrifts and wrote promises across the heavens. King would never leave her, Mafara would never stop fighting, and Marcus would never stop believing in miracles. If this story touched your heart the way it touched ours, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss more powerful journeys like this one. I'd love to hear what part of Amara and King's story moved you the most. Was it the moment King refused to leave her side, the fight at the funeral, or the snowy promise at the end? Share your favorite scene in the comments, and let us know where you're watching from. Your words keep these stories alive,